So to begin, as Nick said, my name is Jahkarli Romanis, and as a proud Pita woman, I respectfully acknowledge the ongoing custodians of the land in which I am presenting this talk on today, belonging to the Bunurong people of the Kulin nations. I want to acknowledge and extend my deep respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I thank Wa, the protector, and Bunjil, the creator spirit, for watching over us while we are on Bunurong land. I would also like to pay my deep respects to the ongoing custodians of Pita country, my elders and ancestors, and my family who I owe this project to. I also acknowledge all First Nations people viewing this presentation today. Sovereignty was never ceded. So I'm going to begin this presentation with this quote from Brian Martin's lived experience. Place is a geographical location, but also a way of thinking. It is land that has its own subjectivity. It is here that my practice articulates the subjectivity of country as a living thing. It informs us who and how we are. So to give a little bit of context to my family history, I suppose, which is really important to this project. Pita country, as you can see on the map, is in the western region of Queensland, and I've grown up here in Victoria. And my family have been dislocated from country for 3 generations. And so this project really is about reconnecting with country, reconnecting with kin, and finding a way of kind of repairing a lot of the issues that colonialism has placed on my family. So this is Pita country. That small speck down the bottom there, that's my mother. So it's the matrilineal line in my family that identifies with Pita. And these images I made when I was last there in 2019. This is my great-grandmother, Dolly. She was taken from country as a child and never came home. I'm always thinking about her and her experiences when I'm making and researching. And as I said before, my family really is very integral to this project. But this image in particular was made by Norman Tyndale, who was an anthropologist that mapped genealogical sort of family trees through the 30s to the 60s. And this image in particular is important because whilst Tyndale's practices were rooted in kind of racism and colonialism, a lot of his work informs and lets me know actually where I've come from. Without this image, I wouldn't actually know what Dolly looks like. So with that in mind, another quote from Ariella Azoulay's Potential History and Learning and Imperialism. Camera shutter draws 3 dividing lines. In time, between a before and an after. In space, between who/what is in front of the camera and who/what is behind it. And in the body politic, between those who possess and operate such devices and appropriate and accumulate their product, and those whose countenance, resources, or labour are extracted. So when we're thinking about this quote in relation to Tyndale's image of Dolly, really what I'm trying to do in my practice is keeping these 3 dividing lines in mind, but also thinking about how, the shutter and the camera as a device can actually be a thing that brings things together rather than a tool for slicing and splicing. So the beginning of this project was rooted in subverting the colonial gaze. So I was looking at settler colonial imagery of my ancestors, and by making self-portraits and layering myself with images of country, I was trying to have agency over my representation as a Pita woman. And really this exercise is about kind of coming back home as well. So chugging along, in 2020, as Nick said, I began an honours project, which was, kind of another iteration of Disconnected to Country. And really, I was interested in continuing this self-portraiture and layering of country together. But of course, traveling at that point in time wasn't possible. And so I thought I'd go there virtually. And so what you're looking at here are videos of pitter pitter through Google Earth gaze and what you actually see of the landscape. And that's really, seeing this information became a catalyst and, an interest for me in trying to understand why the landscape has been represented this way, but also the colonial practices embedded within mapping technologies. So these are just a few questions that I'm trying to answer through my PhD research. But Western approaches to mapping throughout history have served as a function of colonialism and a tool for political power and control through the assertion of ideas about space and place. And so I'm trying to highlight that these tools aren't neutral, they're not objective, there are very subjective decisions made about the information and knowledges included within them. So this image, Waddy Tree, is kind of the big catalyzing image, I suppose, for me in how I'm sort of bringing these technologies and thinking about these technologies within my practice as an artist, but also as a researcher. And so what you're looking at is a Waddy tree, which is a corroboree tree for my people. And it's sitting on top of Google Earth's representation. So that dark shadow of pixels that you see, that's the Waddy tree within Google Earth. And really what I'm trying to say is like this tree exists and it's important. But again, coming back to highlighting how Google Earth is actually imaging these places. So another part of my practice is poetry. So I'll read this to you. Her face sits still, all marks of age sealed in time, sealed in an airtight shutter, not a moment to suffocate. Already dead-eyed and recessed, flat, reduced to brittle paper, flat, reduced to an object to be looked at, flat. You hang on walls at the height I imagine you would be, just so I can pretend to perceive you. To think anyone could really capture you, what an insult. They have tried for centuries to capture. They have failed. Did you know we are the same age? My grandmother, a mere twinkle in your eye at this stage. I look at you the way I stare into a mirror, waiting to recognize myself. A glimpse of acquainted resemblance. We are strangers who share an uncanny familiarity. I'm conflicted that I owe this man the opportunity to see you. Looking is not the same as seeing. Seeing is not the same as knowing. I know you in my bones. That is where I hold you. And so the poetry, it all kind of comes together as another way of exploring a lot of the emotional kind of heaviness that this project is trying to kind of make sense of. And so that poem is about this photograph of Dolly by Norman Tyndale. And again, thinking about how the camera and those three dividing lines can be problematic and sort of an act of violence in a way. So we come back to this image of Dolly, and I've brought her back home and I've laid her in images of country as a way of kind of taking the power away from Tyndale and bringing it back to Dolly. So I've got another poem for you. Where does your body lay? Do your bones ache for another kind of all-enveloping earth, a golden dirt you haven't seen nor touched since the moment they tore your feet from it? To think, even in death, you weren't returned and lowered into the ground next to your mother, along with all the others, a fractured family no stranger to the deepest grief. I cannot comprehend your mother's pain as she lived the rest of her days struck with the kind of self-blame that burns holes in your lungs. To breathe without knowing where your daughter has gone is the kind of inhalation which will forever feel shallow. I consider myself lucky. But some days I wake and I feel this ache. The same ache in my bones is the one that will always dwell in yours. The same ache for a place once known, but now lost, once home, but now foreign. Only twice in my life have I sighted this golden dirt, sucking in its fine dust with the hope it will help your mother, wherever she is now. Breathe a little easier, a little lighter, a little deeper. After all this time, through me, in me, with me, you have finally returned home back to her. And these are just some install photos of a show earlier this year where the poems I recorded and people could actually listen to while looking at the image of Dolly. And I really value the spoken word in that it's a form of kind of oral history as well, existing with the experience of when you actually listen and hear the words. So another concept that's become really important within my practice is called palimpsest, a manuscript or piece of writing material in which later writing has been superimposed or effaced on earlier writing, something reused or altered, but still bearing visible traces of its earlier form. And I think palimpsest is kind of a word that perfectly describes my practice in that it's about layering, it's about bringing things together. It's about utilizing materials from imaging technologies and photographs and repurposing them, changing the narratives that are present within those images. And so this really came about through a creative residency that I did with Melbourne Art Library earlier this year. And they really wanted me to kind of interact with the collection in a critical way. And I found this book called In Our Own Image, The Story of Australian Art by Donald Williams, which was published in the 60s. And it was a high school textbook which had a chapter about art of the Australian Aborigine. And of course, you can understand that the context that this book was written in, a lot of the information is completely incorrect. But I wasn't interested in kind of cancelling that knowledge because I believe that knowledge, although it might be problematic, we're constantly building upon. Again, coming back to this idea of palimpsest. So what I did was I actually just edited what he wrote. So you could still see what was written, but, altering kind of, from my perspective, what needed to be changed, and coming from, an Indigenous perspective, what I felt was important to acknowledge and disrupt within this book. So bringing it back again to the mapping technologies, I'm sorry if this is all a bit jumbled. I hope it makes sense. So coming back to thinking about Google Earth, I've made a series of images that is sort of an in-transition phase between Street View and aerial satellite imaging. And what's interesting to think about with these imaging technologies, particularly satellite and aerial, is that it's born of the military-industrial complex. And so it was initially used as a way of spying on other nations. And yeah, we're sort of publishing the whole world for people to access. And I think that's really problematic. But these works are sort of a way of disrupting the technology, or where it's glitching and dysfunctioning, essentially. And so what you're looking at is pitter-pitter again, but as I said earlier, in transition between this street view and the satellite imaging in this kind of like third realm that comes about. So in these images, the breaking down, or where the technology is dysfunctioning, I think is representative of the dysfunctionality of the colonial agenda and this idea of terra nullius being no man's land, because that's obviously not true. Indigenous peoples have lived in so-called Australia for more than 60,000 years. And I think it's kind of humorous that there's still glimpses of terra nullius within these really contemporary technologies. Well, not humorous, but ironic, I suppose. So I'll just explain terra incognita. Within early maps of Australia in the 1600s, terra incognita was a term coined by mappers and explorers, and it essentially means land unknown. And so a lot of early maps, that's 5 minutes, okay. Cool. A lot of earlier maps kind of have the western region all sorted and mapped, and then the eastern region of Australia is left blank. And this idea of terra incognita being a place that needs to be discovered, being a place that needs to be known by, explorers, by settlers. So that's what terra incognita means. It's just an install photo of the works. So this is a video called Cache, which speaks to mapping again, but also memories mapping, and how, for me, if I think about country, the images that I've made of country have blended so much with my memory that they're sort of inseparable. And I think about Dolly and how memory would have been so important to her, remembering where she's come from, remembering her family and country, because she never went back. And so I'll just play a really short section of it. So this is in Google Earth again, the third realm. The flickering of images is kind of akin to the way that I recall place. So I'll just pause that, you get the gist. So that's an install image of the video work. So to finish with another quote from Brian Martin, observing and listening in a retrospective way seems to elicit a chronological response, not because it is linear, but because knowledge compounded with learning is exponential. And in this way, it is much simpler to explain it, without forgetting that life operates in a cyclic way, building upon new knowledge and old knowledge and experience. Thanks.